Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Patricia Capella, Conference Manager with Clarion Events. Thank you so much for joining us today for our exciting and informative webcast series, Tribal Gaming in the New Normal with Victor Rocha. We are excited to have Jonodev Chaudhuri with us today for a discussion on the McGirt versus Oklahoma decision. Really quick, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items to keep in mind. All audience members are in listen-only mode, which means you are muted. We will be monitoring audience engagement on the dashboard and do encourage you to participate by using the question pane. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. We are recording this webinar and you will receive an email with a copy of the recording so that you may listen to and refer back to it at any time. This webinar, as well as others in our series, will also be made available on our website, indiangamingtradeshow.com, under the Education tab in the coming week. Now, without further delay, let me introduce Victor, Conference Chairman with the National Indian Gaming Association and editor of Pachanga.net. Victor, it's all yours.
Thank you, Patty. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Victor Rocha. My co-host is National Gaming Association Executive Director Jason Giles. Good morning, Jason. And this is the new normal. In today's conversation, Jason and I will be talking to Creek Nation Ambassador Jonodev Chaudhuri and about the recent SCOTUS decision about McGirt versus Oklahoma. Now, McGirt versus Oklahoma, for those who don't know, was a landmark United States Supreme Court decision which ruled that as pertaining to the Major Crimes Act, much of the eastern portion of the state of Oklahoma remains as Native American lands of the prior Indian reservations of the 5 civilized tribes, never disestablished by Congress as part of the Oklahoma Enabling Act of 1906. Now, this isn't just a legal case, this is a story. This is a story of America, this is a story of her promises, and the promises kept and the promises broken. So, you know, Jason, this was a kind of one of those groundbreaking cases, you know, that every once in a while that we see in Indian country. I know before this decision came down, you know, we were all kind of had our fingers crossed, and, you know, the case was supposed to be decided last year and it got rolled over to this year. And then it was on the last day of the last thing. So it was very nerve-wracking, you know. What do you think, Jason?
Well, thank you, Victor.
Losing you, brother.
Can you guys hear me?
There you are.
Yeah. So thank you, Jonodev, for joining us this morning. And for our audience, hopefully you can withstand two Creek Nation citizens giving you their spin on this very epic decision by the Supreme Court. But let me just say, it was an epic decision, and there are actually 2 cases that were brought together by this. And the thing that scared Indian country throughout was these were bad fact cases. You know, none of the people involved who brought these cases were good actors. They were criminals, and we all recognize that. But you know, Jonodev, there's the old saying, you know, bad facts make bad law. Well, we got one where bad facts made good law, and because it really just came down to sovereignty. And Jonodev's been out there talking on this, and his great op-ed pieces in the various national publications. We should send those out so folks can read those. But Victor, you touched on something. I'll just let the folks on the call know. This is a story about America. You can't look at these cases unless you understand the history of America. And one of the things, Muskogee Creek Nation, we're a very proud tribe. Jonodev's mom was a great historian. My brother's an anthropological major who's worked for our tribe and previously is still working with the Seminole tribe. You can't understand these cases unless, like you said, Victor, the 5 civilized tribes of America. Why were they brought to prominence at the beginning? Well, a couple things. The southeast of America was a very big industrial base. A lot of it's not taught well in the history books about the European race to colonize the southeast part of the nation. I don't know how many people know that the French, the Spanish, all had bases in North Carolina, what is now North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and of course we know about the Spanish ones in Florida, but the French had some too. They were all trying to colonize that area, but it's a very difficult terrain. Disease and everything else generally ravaged those early European settlements. So the 5 tribes that were living there, and other tribes too, let's not forget them, you know, they had great advantages over the European settlers early on in this nation's history. And just to fast forward, and by fast forward I mean to 1790, America, you know, got its independence, and you know, we defeated the British around 1785, but it took a while to get the Constitution authorized and everyone signed off. So 1789 is when the Constitution was finally ratified by the states. The first treaty signed by the newly formed United States government was with the Creek Nation. And why was that? We were one of the largest tribes. We abutted the Carolinas at the time. And unfortunately, one of the bigger issues for them reaching out and making a deal with the Creek Nation was runaway slaves. They couldn't have this big nation right on their border, which was welcoming to runaway slaves, because that would have caused obviously a lot of economic pain for them. And and then it turns out, you know, the Creek Nation eventually and the 5 tribes eventually had their own slaves. So there is a lot to be learned about the history of America if you just look at that part of the state, the country there, and why we were removed to Oklahoma, why Andrew Jackson is not a good man. All these things for hundreds of years were just bubbling. And it all culminated in with this long stance that Oklahoma has taken, that our reservations were disestablished. The 5 civilized tribes reservations were disestablished. We were removed to a land we didn't want to go to. We won a Supreme Court opinion that was disregarded and moved to an area unwillingly at the Trail of Tears. So this really is a long time coming. The hyperbole it's not hyperbole when you read these things about justice and all these upholding of the Constitution, upholding of the treaties. This is everything encapsulated in one decision here that can be applied across Indian country and throughout this country from a historical standpoint and from a treaty standpoint and ultimately a tribal sovereignty standpoint. That's the importance of this case. And just thankfully, you know, Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch was able to get back in this fold into the decision, because initially he had to recuse himself. He was on the 10th Circuit in a similar case and was recused. We probably still would have been okay on a 4-4 decision because they won at the lower level. But it's just great to have this language and the most powerful stating in there that if Congress and the president want to disavow a treaty, then they can do it on their own time and they can go before the public and do that. And, you know, that's what we've been saying for hundreds of years. And even if you're not a non-treaty tribe, presidential executive orders, congressional recognition recognizing your tribe, these are all part of our constitutional law. So that's why it's such a major opinion here. And the specifics of it were not great, but the end result is great.
Wow. You know, like I said, you know, the story is so compelling because you really are dealing with manifest destiny. You're dealing with power, you're dealing with economics. And, you know, there was a promise. And like you said, you know, Andrew Jackson disavowed the Supreme Court decision. You know, we did everything we were supposed to do. We were told this is the way you play the game, and then the rules were changed. And it really is, in a nutshell, you know, everything about America, you know, that we've had to do with Native Americans. And to me, though, it brings back this story, this live, real American narrative back that, you know, it's not that far back. It's very close. Jonodev, first of all, welcome, man. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's an honor to be here. I'm very thankful for the invitation. It's an honor to be on the panel with my fellow Muskogee, and it's great to see you. So thank you so much to you, Victor Strategies, Clarion Events. I'm honored to be with you today.
Well, you know, when you have two creeks on a Zoom call, you're supposed to make a wish. So just letting you know. That's
Usually when you have more than one creek, those creeks start fighting. So
right. Well, that's three creeks. That's a whole other different one. You know what I mean? I do know, two creeks on a Zoom call is actually good luck. So, but
absolutely.
first of all, Jonodev, what a story, man. First of all, let's start 2 weeks ago. Let's start, tomorrow is exactly 2 weeks ago that it happened. So tell me about Wednesday, man. How was your Wednesday,
Oh,
It was a
wow.
year of How about a year of Wednesdays? Tell me about your year of Wednesdays.
Yeah, well, let me talk about what the decision was and what it wasn't. I think what it was regardless of the actual decision. I think the decision resonates. I mean, the actual legal import of the decision, the ruling kind of reverberated throughout the hearts and souls of our entire people, our entire nation, because it was a recognition that despite all the deprivations, all the very tragic dealings with the United States and European nations that we've lived through, we've survived. The highest court and the federal system recognized that regardless of the legal implications, our home is our home. And to not be erased in your own home resonates with every Creek, but I think it resonates with every Indian person out there. So, as soon as I heard the decision, I told my boys that, your home has been preserved and it will always be your home. And frankly, we cried. And I think that was a very, very common reaction for a lot of Creeks. And it wasn't a legal reaction. I mean, we can talk about what the decision means in legal terms, and I'm happy to address those things on this panel. But it was a very personal decision that, hit home for all of us, all the sacrifices that our ancestors made and through extraordinarily difficult experiences means something. And they fought so that there'd be a tomorrow for their great 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 grandchildren, and that tomorrow's finally here. So, anybody who grew up Creek, and just like so many Native people, your family histories are filled with tragic events, and just to have one moment where the fights mattered and you won means something. Now, on a very basic legal level, we're so, as Jason mentioned, so thankful that Gorsuch applied the law. It was an intellectually honest opinion, regardless of where he may come from philosophically. One thing he has told folks is that he's a believer in the law, and the law has traditionally been on the side of natives. You can't take over a continent without there being some breadcrumbs about what the law is and what it should have been, but the law hasn't always been respected. Jason mentioned that the first treaty between the United States and a nation was Treaty of New York. Muskogee Creek Nation entered into that. That, like so many of our treaties and treaties between other nations, was broken. And the law said what it said, but it didn't stop the relentless march of the thirst for land, the thirst for resources. And for one moment, despite that history, for Justice Gorsuch to be joined by 4 other justices who looked at the law and said, despite efforts by the state to destroy this tribe, to destroy this reservation, despite efforts by Congress to destroy this tribe and destroy this nation, unless Congress says a reservation is established, it continues to exist. And this wasn't an exact quote, but this is to paraphrase. If Congress is to disestablish a reservation, it has to do it so that it shows the whole world it's doing so. And
Yeah, I thought that was really amazing, that statement, and as a non-lawyer and a non-Creek, you know, there was real poetry in that writing. You know, I've read a couple op-eds where actually people were saying that Gorsuch's writing has become even better. But what was amazing to me was the dissent. You know what I mean? I've never seen that much acrobatics since the last Cirque du Soleil tryout. I mean, intellectually, these guys tied themselves in Gordian knots to like not make the right decision, and it was just, that was like what we expected, though, you know what I mean? Which is really quite sad that, you know, we had that type of expectations, but yet here it was, you know, we had this decision that was acknowledging this history and these promises. And more importantly, it reminded you that, you know, they're still valid. You know what I mean? The promises that your great grandfathers made, you know, are still valid today. And that was just quite amazing, I think, for a non-lawyer like myself and for a bunch of this. So Jonodev, how did we get there? How did this happen? I mean, is it just America, you know, people moving next door, and, you know, is it just, how did this happen?
Yeah, well, during removal, the treaty that the last treaty to define our reservation was post-removal. Some people have described it as a reparations treaty, but and certainly Justice Kavanaugh during oral arguments took great effort to point out the history of our tribe and the other 5 tribes of slave ownership. But that's only part of the history. The treaty that was in place was issued after the Civil War and the 1866 treaty, and it said our lands would continue to exist forever. And of course, we know that language in the treaty wasn't respected by the state. But one thing I want to point out about those treaties, and a lot of treaties, frankly most, those treaties were imposed on our nation. They were nation-to-nation treaties, but there's a lot of history that goes into those treaties. Let me just take a brief moment to talk about my family experience. My family, like many Creeks, we were Upper Creeks, and most of the Upper Creeks fought against the Confederacy. And there was a split within the Creek Nation during the Civil War. We had our own Civil War, and I had relatives, including the grandfather of my grandfather, or the grandfather of my grandmother, grandfather of my grandfather, who was a Union soldier who fought alongside our great leader, Apotli when we fought against the Confederacy. None of that mattered when it came time to issue treaties to resolve Indian lands after the Civil War. All the Creeks who fought for the Confederacy and for the Union got lumped together, and a treaty was imposed that, despite great great takings of land, at least reserved what our reservation is today to never be touched. And that was what Gorsuch was looking at when evaluating whether or not all the subsequent legislation, all the subsequent efforts by the state to further encroach upon our lands removed our treaty status. And let me mention some of those events. Some of those events we're all familiar with: the Great Land Run and the Sooners. And the whole idea of the Sooners is whoever gets to the surplus Indian land first gets to stake a claim. Those are all products of the allotment policies of the United States. And allotment was designed to do, as it was described at the time, to pulverize. It was called the Great Pulverizing Machine, to pulverize the nationhood of Creek Nation as well as the other tribes in Oklahoma, so that they would no longer be community-based, they would be individually based. And so the allotment policies chopped up land, whatever gave certain parcels to individual landowners, and claimed whatever was left was surplus for the Sooners and for everybody that came in for the land rush. The Gorsuch looked at statutes like that and said, well, you know, does that mean, and he also looked at the laws surrounding Oklahoma statehood and said, well, Simply, the law is, did Congress ever disestablish the reservation? Nowhere in any of those acts was that the case, and Gorsuch came down on the right side. But it's a very limited case, and right now, technically, and frankly, it's limited to the Muskogee Creek Nation. There certainly may be implications to other 5 tribes or other tribes in Oklahoma or beyond, but that will have to get sorted out in time. But right now, the direct application is to criminal law in Muskogee Creek Nation. Now, part of that was a finding that our reservation is part of Indian country under 18 USC 1151, which brings with it a lot of implications. But regardless of the limited holding and what implications may come from that, the fact that all of those acts from the state as well as Congress to destroy the fabric of our nation, to turn us into individually driven people rather than tribally oriented, community-minded, civic-minded, clan-based, kinship-based nations, none of that worked. None of that worked. Our reservation survives, and now we have the opportunity to build with clarity provided by Gorsuch and the Supreme Court, to continue building towards a life that's truly consistent with who we are as a people. That's what self-determination is. I want to make one final point. There's nothing scary about that. There was a lot of rhetoric before the case, and frankly, even after the case, that half of Oklahoma is going to the Indians. Not 1 inch of land actually changed hands in this case. Nobody lost land, and nobody has to sell land unless, there's nothing about that in the case. The inflammatory rhetoric about the sky is falling that preceded the case, and frankly, some of which has followed it, is just unfortunate because it's not based in the law. All this means is that the rules have been clarified, so Muskogee Creek Nation, as a sovereign, can work with other sovereigns to protect the public interest. That's what sovereigns do. That's what Muskogee Creek Nation has done despite all the deprivations. And we look to build on those intergovernmental agreements that we've already had in place, and to work with state, local, county, federal officials to grow from here. People were saying there's confusion, or there may be chaos or the inflammatory rhetoric said there would be chaos if the court found in our favor. There's no chaos. There's clarity. We know what the rules are, and now it's time to roll up our sleeves and work collectively as sovereigns do, with mutual respect for the betterment of everyone within our borders.
As a layman, it's kind of mind-blowing is that we're actually talking about the Oklahoma land grab and all that stuff too, and how it still relates to it. But the thing that sticks out with me, and Jason, I'd like you to comment on this. Doesn't this kind of send a message to groups that are really anti-tribal and that are looking for that case law to chip away at sovereignty? You know what I mean? Like groups like the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, or some of these land organizations, and and actually, one of the big issues that I'm seeing is you're seeing. I saw an op-ed from one of the big oil manufacturers, oil producers in Oklahoma. They're saying, well, this is going to be double taxation and stuff like that. How do you see that falling out? Is that just more rhetoric and more scare tactics?
That's alarmist stuff, and you see it in California. What's Stand Up for California, that Cheryl Schmidt, who for years has been spreading disinformation out that way. All those types of groups are on notice now that, the federal, at least this Supreme Court, recognizes a promise when they see it, and it doesn't matter how old it is, it's going to stand. And all those groups are on notice. And fortunately, we have had a number of very good decisions in the past 10 years that have upheld tribal sovereignty, upheld a tribe's land base. The case in Michigan, all these different cases have come together to really strengthen tribal sovereignty. unfortunately, at the same time, there is an element of maybe they're empowering Congress too much on Indian affairs. And that's always a concern, because when Congress starts writing legislation, we Indians always usually get the short end of the stick. But what this decision does, just to move, set aside the historical for just a second, I'll get back to it. But right now, I think the 5 tribes are in a position to where we've got to start looking at getting back some of this land. It is our land, but a lot of it is not in trust. I know Muskogee. Well, actually, the statistics I was looking up, just take Seminole Nation for a second, which is right there in the eastern half of Oklahoma as well. Less than 2% of where their tribal members live, less than 2% of their land, or their original reservation, is in trust. Less than 2%. So, we should take this opportunity to do something like the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin has, where they have a whole tribal administrative office that is putting their land back into trust. Is that fair? No. I mean, literally, Oneida Nation has been, whenever they see a piece of property go on the market, they go and try to buy it. And then when they buy it, when the tribe buys it, they put an application into the interior to put it into trust. And this is land within their original reservation boundaries. Well, now we're in the same position. We've always said we're in the same position, but now we have a Supreme Court confirming what we always knew to be true, that this was our reservation status. We never gave it away. We never gave away Tulsa. We should have a system now for practical application to go around. And a lot of our tribal members have lived in the same place for a couple generations. And even if they've lived there for 40 or 50 years and they want to keep it in their family, the tribe, we should start developing practices and procedures to get more land into trust, to preserve our land and our culture. Because as Jonodev pointed out, we started out in Alabama and the Carolinas, and in what is now Georgia, and look where we're at. And same with the other 4 tribes. And this historical aspect of it, and not to give folks a big history lesson, but Victor, you may get your battle here between me and Jonodev. He said he's got family that fought for the Union. Well, part of my family, my Creek family, they fought for the Confederate side. And I got this shirt about 15 years ago at our Creek Festival there in the summer, and they were selling that, at one of the tents. And Battle of Fort Smith. If people know Fort Smith, Arkansas, the Creeks where they're marching with Confederate general at the head, fighting Union troops. I mean, it was a bit of a fiasco because Jonodev pointed out we were split fighting each other, and then Grant took it out on all of us. But and same with the slavery issue. I mean, part of the reason a lot of Creeks owned slaves, so they were more inclined to fight with the South and go and protect their right to have slaves at that time. And fast forward all these historical things that we're addressing now as a nation. We've been addressing these in our 5 tribes for a long time with the issue of the freedmen. I feel like Muskogee Creek Nation has done a good job addressing the Black ancestors' legacies in our tribe, and having to deal with this whole fiction that was imposed upon us of blood quantum. That's just a fiction thing that the United States imposed upon tribes across the country and Native Hawaiians. But so if you have direct ancestral history and you're an African American, but you're now a Creek citizen, you have full citizenship in our tribe, and we've always tried to take care of folks in that manner, and respecting where this country is going and dealing with these issues of slavery and just history, being taught history. I think that I hate that word cancel culture. That this whole thing is coming out because every time somebody walked past a Confederate monument, you might wonder and ask, like, why the heck is a monument to a traitor sitting anywhere in this country? It's a good question. If you're African American, it's just downright offensive. When President Trump puts a picture of Andrew Jackson up in the West Wing right behind him, I mean, that's beyond the pale for the tribes in Oklahoma. So all these things need to be rethought and re-examined. And it's not about canceling anything. It's about none of this was ever taught anywhere to begin with. It was just sort of fiction made up and putting a rosy spin on everything, and which just wasn't true with regards to the facts and the historical makeup of this country. So until we really resolve all that and get a more inclusive narrative of our country, we're always going to be fighting these battles. But I think we're closer to that than ever. And I would say right now is the time to do it. We more and more, everybody's just getting involved in the rich history of America and seeing just how this country developed. And it's a fascinating story. So why would you ever just give all this credit to Christopher Columbus, who never stepped a damn foot in this area? And oh, by the way, the whole continent is named after Amerigo Vespucci. If you're going to give a statue to any Italian for coming over here, do it to Amerigo Vespucci. He, in his journals, when he was going up and down the east coast of the United States, he was afraid to port anywhere because there were so many campfires that he was seeing up and down the east coast from Miami up to Maine, that he thought there must have been 20 million people here, and he just was reluctant to make landfall here. But the continent is named America after Amerigo. It's not hard to figure out a lot of this history. It's all written down. So I think that's where we're headed as a country, and I couldn't be happier. And I think tribes should start to look and be proactive in this day and start to take back what was always theirs. And if we get a good administration, if we get good cooperation from the federal government, a lot of this can be corrected over time.
Wow. Well, Jason, like I said, this story is just so compelling. And, you bring up the freemen, and that's another facet. And, it isn't just very simple and linear. It just goes in so many directions. And like America, it's a very complicated story. So now we know the history. So what are we looking at here? What is the ramifications, Jonodev? I mean, can the Creek now open up a casino in Tulsa? Can they do sports betting in Tulsa now? Can we? I mean, what is the ramifications here?
Well, okay, so let me just touch on one issue that Jason brought up. I mean, I think the best part of this decision is it clarifies some of the issues around our reservation status, so that as a nation we can help define the trajectory of the reservation that we have, consistent with our history and our values. And part of that does involve talking about our history and addressing these things. But again, the history is complicated. I did want to mention that family side of the history in terms of us being Upper Creeks, because a lot of listeners just think Creeks are one people. We were kind of a confederacy ourselves back when confederacy was a good word, because we were the combination of tribal towns throughout the Southeast, even all the way down to northern Florida, and we were unified in common concern. Those independent yet shared goals kind of filtered through history, and that led to kind of divisions between Upper Creeks and Lower Creeks. And I do want to throw one point out, just to kind of, in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, one of the most tragic losses for our people, the Red Sticks, who were primarily Upper Creeks, were brutally, some people say it was a battle, but basically it was a massacre, defeated by Andrew Jackson. But it took fellow nations and fellow Creeks to do that. So in that battle, you had Upper Creeks fighting Lower Creeks, but you also had us fighting Andrew Jackson and the U.S. Army. But you also had, I'm not going to throw any other nations under the bus right now, but you had other tribal nations aligned against the Upper Creeks, and that was kind of the last stand before all of the parts of removal kind of fell into place. So I did want to kind of throw that history out. Where things stand, we can talk about the immediate implications of the law, which are frankly minimal. To Jason's point, hopefully at the very least, this will clarify the process that the BIA undergoes when putting land into trust. Having worked at Interior before, I know that there's a standard land analysis that takes place whenever you put in a land into trust application. The hope is with this clarity that will be a more straightforward process. In terms of gaming, you still have the provisions under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act that apply to the Oklahoma tribes and Oklahoma lands, and all those will remain in full force and effect. We will only be able to game on lands eligible for gaming under IGRA, which has always been the case. And had we put land into trust before, we could game on that before, with some nuances that we could go into more, but they'll take some time. But the bigger point that I want to make is no sooner were we, just about to kind of be able to celebrate after crying, given the importance of this case. We didn't even have a full week to really kind of fully digest the impact of this opinion. Word came that the Oklahoma Attorney General was announcing that there was a joint agreement in principle to be signed on to for the purpose of consideration for codification in federal law, basically a package to be sent to Congress. Within 24 hours of that announcement, fortunately, my nation, as well as the Seminole Nation, pointed out that, wait a second, there's been a rush to judgment here, a rush to announcement. It's true that folks had talked about what would the implications of a decision, win, lose, or draw, mean to the state and to the tribes, but there was never an agreement to send a package to Congress. And now the battle is, once, after winning this historic decision that recognizes treaty rights, recognizes jurisdiction, and recognizes sovereignty, now we have to fight to defend it. And so, hopefully Congress recognizes that no diminishment of this historic win should be made. The definition of a legislative fix is that there's something to be fixed. And from our nation's perspective, as well as, Indian people throughout the country, the recognition of sovereignty isn't something that needs to be fixed. So hopefully cooler heads prevail. And there's been a lot of talk about the potential of, members of Congress who may be sympathetic to oil and gas supporting legislation. I caution anybody who works from a place of fear and lets that fear result in the immediate surrender of sovereignty. I would instead suggest that our time, effort, and energies are put into fighting any rollback of this historic case. And that's certainly the position that Creek Nation has taken. Now, I realize there are a couple nations that are willing to discuss legislation. I respect, as my leadership does, I respect the sovereign right of any nation to work with Congress. But I think it's important to recognize that there's unity in protecting this decision, and it's important to do that for all Indian country. And I hope we can band together to make sure that no legislation that diminishes this historic win is even considered by Congress. And if anything, we should collectively band together to show that there's nothing for the public to fear here. Reservations exist throughout the United States, and on those reservations, issues of public safety as well as economic development are worked out between sovereigns, between the tribe and the state and the counties. There's no difference here. In a previous life, I was a judge for a tribe in the Northwest. I was honored to serve the Puyallup tribe of Indians. And within the Puyallup reservation, a huge chunk of Tacoma exists. And I was on the criminal bench, and I saw how those intergovernmental agreements and cross-deputization agreements work. those agreements work in tribal nations throughout the country. We're going to transition, you know, as quickly as we can to exert what has been affirmed, but this shouldn't be a scary thing. This exists throughout the country, and this is good for everybody. So if anybody wants to see kind of where the tea leaves are, the governor of Oklahoma recently announced a commission to address these issues. Unfortunately, none of the members of none of the leadership of tribal nations were on that commission. There's a general statement hoping that they'll join, but the folks that were announced, you can look at their track records. I'm not going to speak to that, but you can look to see what their records are in terms of what industries they've historically supported. And so things may get unfortunately framed in terms of divisions amongst tribal nations, but this is really a moment where Indian country has the opportunity to push back against oil and gas interests and other economic interests to preserve this historic win. And I'm confident we'll do that. And I'm hopeful that everybody who cares about not just what this meant legally, but what this meant to the fiber of our souls as Native people, what this historic win meant is preserved through all of our efforts and through our vigilance. It was only a week after the decision that this threat emerged, and we need to do whatever we can to protect this historic win.
Yeah, Jonodev, there's the great American philosopher John Paul Getty once said, "The meek shall inherit the earth, but not the mineral rights." So I always remember that statement from the first time I heard that as a child, you know, and I think right now that shows that statement's more true than ever, you know what I mean? And that seems to be where the rub is, that I see the powers that be are freaked out about oil and gas. And again, it's a land issue, you know what I mean? And so, you know, you mentioned that it's very narrow in its scope, and but, you know, I'm starting to see other tribes refer to it, you know, and, you know, this situation, though it might be narrow in its scope, the situation itself is not uncommon, you know what I mean, which is land and promises and stuff like that. So I'm already seeing, last night I saw a statement out of Wyoming talking about how it's not going to affect, the Attorney General says it's not going to deal with any of our land issues. I've seen it in Michigan already with the little river band, I believe. I don't know, maybe it was Little Traverse. Those Little Traverse, actually. And then I've also seen it in Washington. So, you know, what does that mean? And actually, the question is to both of you. You know, what can we see, since I know other tribes. You know, the thing about Indian countries, you know, we share the misery and we share our success, and we share our tactics. So, you know, all the other tribes are now looking at this case. What can we get out of this as Native Americans in other states? What can we get out of this? Now, I guess the question is, you know, should we all go back to the Supreme Court? Should we push it? Should we just wait a while? You know, what are we looking at here? And what does it mean?
Yeah. I'll just be brief, Victor, and follow up on what Jonodev said. What it means right now is go back. Tribes need to go back and look at this case and see what was dispositive in the court's thinking. And one of the things is what Jonodev just pointed out, working with the state, local, and municipalities. The Creek Nation had 40 agreements with the local municipalities and counties where our original reservation was 40 out of the total of 44 that could have been agreed to. So cross deputization, agreements on working together on civil and criminatory matters. And that was a big, I think, factor in the court's decision here, is seeing how everything has already been working in the absence of the state of Oklahoma's acknowledgement that tribes have jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction over their own members as well. So that's one thing tribes should look at. Just try to work out these agreements on the ground level with your local and state folks to the best of your ability. I know it's not always going to be easy. You can speak to that, Victor. It's not always going to be easy. But the Creek Nation and the other tribes have done that and done it successfully. Now, secondly is, you know, this is forcing a great reckoning in Oklahoma of where the state is going. Jonodev, the oil and gas interests that's the only reason Oklahoma's a state is because of oil and gas. So oil and gas it's just, you have Chesapeake Energy about declaring bankruptcy. You have all these great gas companies that are, the writing's on the wall. I don't know if it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever people are going to predict, it's going to happen overnight. I mean, just look at Tesla's stock. It's coming. The oil and natural gas, it's an old industry. Nobody's building new coal plants. Nobody wants to put a new oil refinery in the middle of somewhere. So the state of Oklahoma is going to have to deal with all these issues. And the fact that the tribes now have a case like this to where we can work with the state of Oklahoma again and forge a new path forward. It's what Jonodev is saying. We don't need to give up anything to the state attorney general or to the governor right now. It's a time, especially during a pandemic, where we can start to forge new agreements and new ways of thinking and moving forward together with our neighbors, because we're all going to be there for the next few for the future. Got to start working together better. And I think when tribes go back and look at what was dispositive in this case, it was the fact that no, there's not going to be hundreds of criminals getting out of jails. No, there's not going to be no police showing up to domestic violence calls. That is already on the ground in state of play. And as Jonodev, not that much is going to change on the ground.
So, we've had a really good 3 weeks here. You know what I mean? We've had a decision on the Dakota Access Pipeline to get shut down. We had the Redskins announcing they're going to be changing their names. We've had this decision, which was just massive, and it just feels like there's something in the air, like the pendulum of justice, the arc of justice bending back towards us again. So it feels like there's something bigger here, and I think what a lot of people are responding to, it's like there's Native American people are very prideful, in who they are and where we come from, the fact that we are survivors. So like I said, I'm seeing cases around where tribes are going, well, maybe we should test these boundaries. Is this a good strategy? Is this a good policy? And actually, even before we go into that, I'd like to comment that, John and Jason, this better than anyone, is that because of gaming, we already have these relationships already with policing and off-reservation impact and stuff like that. So for a lot of us in the gaming industry, we already have these relationships. So I imagine, if the tribes do have questions about that, and if there are a smaller tribe that is land deprived and stuff like that, I think they should be reaching out. And Jonodev, if you want to give your phone number, they can call you. Or I'm just kidding, man. You know what I mean? But Jonodev, what is your response? Are you getting, are you seeing the same things I'm seeing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So let me just say, the folks, all three of us are immersed in the gaming world, and we understand the win-win that Indian gaming's been, not just for Native folks, but non-Indian neighbors and non-Indians living on tribal lands. I mean, this is kind of something that we take for granted in the gaming industry, because we look at the downstream analysis of economic impact, and there's some great numbers that come out from NIGA every year that talk about the economic impact of Indian gaming, direct and indirect, being well over $100 billion to the community as a whole. And that's not just natives. You're talking about, probably predominantly non-natives, in the form of jobs, in the form of supporting industries, vendors, food and beverage, all these things. This helps the economy. We're used to this idea. So, at first blush, it's hard for us to see why people would be so concerned about, tribal governments working hand in hand with industry, with other governments for win-win solutions. But for a state that largely has been driven by oil and gas interests, as Jason points out, to want to coordinate or collaborate with tribal nations, it's always been a stretch to do that. But there's nothing scary there. There's nothing scary there for the Oklahoma public, and there's nothing scary there for the American public. Native communities and tribal nations are the best governmental partners around because they're driven by local decision making, protecting public safety in their borders, protecting the environment within their borders. And there's just a slew of win-wins across the board if we all understand the benefit of this decision to natives and non-natives alike. So that's a lesson from Indian gaming that I think those of us that are steeped in that industry just kind of take it for granted, but that idea of win-wins applies across the board. Another thing I want to point out, yes, this has been a historic 2 weeks because you have the McGirt decision, then you have the DAPL decision, and then you have the coming to the light of the Washington football team on their name. But I would caution taking that too far. So one of the beauties of Gorsuch's decision, as we've already discussed, is that it's intellectually honest. I mean, regardless of where Gorsuch comes from, he understands the West, he understands Indian law, he understands the treaty relationship and historic relationship between tribal nations and the U.S. It was a very principled decision. Same thing with the DAPL decision. It was simply understanding that the law requires full engagement when you're making these permitting decisions with the greater the greater public, as well as tribal nations that are impacted. So these are principled decisions that we need to applaud for their intellectual honesty and intellectual rigor. They come at a time of great social consciousness, and we're thankful for that. And certainly the Washington football team name change is directly tied to the advances that others have made in this social awareness. But I wouldn't tie the two together, but I would say, and this is extremely relevant right now, anybody who's afraid of bad legislation being pushed down the throat of Indian country needs to understand the moment. There's been some potential language that's been floated, I think, frankly, as a scare tactic from the oil and gas industry, suggesting that there's language out there that completely reverses McGirt. And that's horrible language, obviously, but I would call upon us all to see it for what it is. It's a scare tactic to try and get Indian country to capitulate and be open to half measures and to be open to legislation that dilutes this important moment. But that's where the social awareness moment comes into play. If we understand that we're more on the side of history than ever in terms of the American public, and the American public understands what this means, not just to Indian people, but to all people who are tired of corporate greed driving public policy, will understand there are a lot of allies out there who would support our efforts to protect and preserve the historic wins made by the McGirt decision. The greatest fear that we have, to quote a well-known phrase, is fear itself. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing to be afraid of in this decision, by the American public. Indian country, we're the best neighbors. We've been the neighbors of this country since day one. We're part of the fabric of this nation, and let's build a better future together.
All very important and very salient points. I think before I go to that, we have a couple questions. We don't have much time, but on the opposite side of that, the governor of Oklahoma has been kind of having a bad week. I think the COVID-19 has kind of fogged his brain up a little bit. Maybe he's on medication or something like that. So I hope he's getting plenty of bed rest, but I wouldn't trust that guy as far as I can throw him, because there's always somebody out there willing to sell us out. We have a question here in the box for one of our listeners, and I think it's kind of an interesting question. Because if the treaty is still valid per the court, can the U.S. pick and choose which provisions within the treaty have been, have been terminated or have become inoperable? And that's a really good question. Can they pick and choose?
Yeah, let me answer that. But before I do, let me just address the governor's health. I, along with many people in our nation, as well as leadership, I'm sure, pray for the governor's health. And, this is a serious public health crisis that we're all fighting. And regardless of any differences of opinion that we may have with the governor, we do pray for him on a very personal level. So I did want to address that. Now, pick and choose, and that's a great question. I don't know to which provisions folks are pointing to that, but as I mentioned before, a lot of these treaties, almost every treaty that I know of, were the products of duress to some degree or the other. In many cases, just like Roman consulates, the U.S. government picked negotiators to sign treaties. And so I think treaties in general, I think it is absolutely correct to hold the United States accountable for the positions they took in their treaties. And that's absolutely correct, recognizing that some treaties are the exception, but most treaties were the product of coercion. I talked about how the Upper Creeks and the Lower Creeks, whether you fought on the Confederacy side or the Union side, it didn't matter. We got thrown into the same bin, and we got removed together, and we got the Civil War was after removal, but we got treated the same way under the law. Now, I think it's a different question when you're trying to, force the government to uphold its word, the U.S. government, that treaties are the law of the land. It's a different question to ask, well, how should treaty language be interpreted? And that's why there is the canon of treaty construction that that simply states that treaties should be interpreted in the way that the Indians understood them at the time, because it recognizes that there were interpretation errors and certainly a coercive element to many of these treaties. That said, I'm a big believer of being honest about our history and doing whatever we can to talk internally. If there's a provision of a treaty that we need to address, we should look at that as a nation. But that should be part of that process itself should be nation building. It should be run through our institutions as a nation and help strengthen the nation rather than have it be externally imposed by anybody else.
Well, you know what? We're pretty close to being to the end, but I think the main thing to take away from this that everyone in any country should pay attention to is the fact that we have a Supreme Court that is paying attention to Indian law, and I think this cuts both ways. I think people who are against tribal sovereignty will think twice about bringing cases, as we've seen. They've been loading them up, and to line them up into the Supreme Court. And then I think also the tribes need to be cautious too on, what they take to the Supreme Court, and what they take to. I think, we have to practice caution at all times. But I think it's been a great 2 weeks, and I think, this case is bringing up a lot of questions. I think the other day the three affiliated tribes, Mandan and those guys there. They're looking, the government, the EPA just decided all this land underneath the rivers didn't belong to them anymore. And, this seemed like something very arbitrary. And again, it has to do with land, has to do with mineral rights and stuff like that too. So, I see this story being continued, but I'm also very happy to see when Justice Gorsuch, writes such beautiful poetry that says, at the end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. I mean, Jesus, that's Shakespeare, man, and that's something and I hope the other people who are thinking twice about coming after Indian country and about the tribes will think twice about it. And, I think it's been a very good 2 weeks for us. So, Jason, you have anything you want to wrap it up with?
Oh, no, I appreciate, Jonodev, I was going to ask you the beautiful painting behind you. Who's the artist and where'd you get that? That's just striking painting.
Thank you. I've got a lot of Creek stuff back there, but that painting is multi-tribal, and I forgive me for forgetting the artist's name, but my mom used to help oversee youth programs and diversion programs in Tucson back in the day, and the artist worked with youth to have art as an outlet for folks who would otherwise go into juvenile detention programs. So that was a joint effort by the artist's name, who I wish my mamaji or my mom was with me right now. They'd be able to tell me right off the bat. But it was also done with at-risk youths in Tucson. It's a peyote. It's a peyote.
Go ahead. So before I go, John, how happy would your mom be about this?
You know, back to the issue of there shouldn't be a point of fear for anybody. We're not I mean, we're good-hearted people. The primary value of our people is love. There's a photo in my living room that's a picture of my mom and her siblings. She had 4 siblings, all of whom have passed. 2 of them died in their teenage years, you know, from TB. And mom and my mamaji, who just died in October, as well as my uncle, all passed away of diabetes-related issues. When they were younger, they were pecan pickers in the aftermath of the Depression. They're migrant workers. We've kept our integrity and never been bitter. My mom would have cried deeply because she would have known what this means in terms of having a say in the future of our lands. Mom would have been greatly moved, not just for herself, but for everyone who's come before us. And so my mom was smiling from above.
Oh, so listen, on that note, Jonodev, thank you so much. This has been so informative. And again, it's a great story, and it's wonderful to get some type of resolution. We still have a long way to go, but the fact that, you know, America made a promise and she has to keep it is always good news. So again, Jason, thank you, my brother. It's always good talking to you, with you, my co-host. I'd like to thank Jonodev, the ambassador for the Creek Nation, former chairman of the National Gaming Commission, and just an all-around great guy, Jonodev. And then, you know what? Also, next week, I'd like everyone to tune in. We're going to be talking with Chairman Brian Newland from the Bay Mills Indian community, talking about sports betting and talking about mobile gaming, and that's going to be really fascinating also. So Jonodev, thank you very, very much. I know we'll see you again, so thanks a lot, brother. And everyone too, we'll see you guys soon. Thanks, bye.
Talk to you soon.